All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the latest in our series of Eno Center for Transportation webinars. Today we are presenting on data sharing and privacy. To help us understand a little more about transportation data availability, usage, sharing, privacy, business and research uses, we are very happy to be joined by Dr. Mark Hallenbeck. Dr. Hallenbeck is the director of the Washington State Transportation Center at University of Washington. He's been instrumental in setting up the Transportation Data Collaborative, a trusted data repository in the state of Washington, and he has been involved in many excellent research projects utilizing and evaluating transportation data over the years. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, so please feel free to enter your questions in the question box on the side of your screen at any time, and we will get to as many of those as possible after the presentation. Also, do note that we will be uploading a recording of the webinar and the slides to our website for future reference. We're sure you're going to find this discussion interesting and timely, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Mark.
Good afternoon, or I should say, isn't that a famous Robin Williams thing? It's good morning, Vietnam. So good afternoon, America. I don't know, maybe Walter Cronkite, if you're old enough to know him, said something like that. Welcome, and let's talk about data sharing and privacy. One thing you'll notice is I have way too many slides, but they're downloadable, and you guys can take a look at them solely at your own time frame. But other than that, I will go quickly through these things. So data is the new thing. Everybody is suddenly concerned about it. These are two of my favorite quotes, but you could spend a lot of time pulling cool quotes out about data. I really like, however, from a business perspective, without big data analytics, companies are blind and deaf and wandering out onto the web like deer on a freeway. It's a good transportation quote. The real issue, of course, is that technology is giving us tons and tons of data, and an awful lot of that data is about location and therefore travel. So cell phones, all kinds of other electronic devices, electronic payments set up data. That data allows us a whole new series of transportation options. Those options are based on the fact that we now can describe where we are, where we want to go, when we want to travel, and other people, service providers, can grab information about their services and tell them to you when you want them so that you can make decisions. That's really good if you're a traveler. When you add the concept that people will pay for service, good service, therefore money, to the fact that I can collect all these cool new data types easily, readily, and inexpensively, I get a business opportunity. And that business opportunity provides all kinds of new services that 15 years ago we only dreamed about. Once you look at that, however, you start to realize what the data really are. The data describe how a human or a vehicle or a device, which in many respects are interchangeable, where they are in time and space. When you take a particular identifier, a device, a vehicle, whatever, and look at it over time, you get a trace. I.e., I can figure out where that device, your phone, which actually equals you, or your car, which comes very close to equaling you, I know where that vehicle is going, has been. The different kinds of devices, the different kinds of data collection sources change how often you see a device or an individual. They change how spatially accurate a report of a location is, or a report of time. And you do not always have a one-to-one correlation of device to people, but they are pretty close. You also have to remember or realize that these data collection sources are both public and private. If you have an electronic fare card, you're in Washington, D.C., and you have a WMATA smart fare card, you tap into the subway, you tap out to the subway, you've just indicated an origin and destination within the transit system. They can follow you over time. They understand how often you use the system, where you go to. They can even drive out patterns of your use, how often you use it, what places you go. Trace data, that is the path of a particular device, therefore create interesting privacy concerns. But the privacy concerns actually fit two separate categories. The first category is individual. That's what I've been talking about. But there's also corporate or business privacy concerns. We'll talk about those both. First, individual privacy, what we've been talking about. Travel trace data are inherently identifiable. If you haven't read it and you're interested in this topic, the best article ever is Unique in the Crowd. And if you put that into your basic web search, you will get a copy of it and you can read it and you'll see some of these things afterwards. It was done by Montoya, an MIT professor, and a group of his collaborators, and it used a very large cell phone-based data set. They got hourly pings, so I see a phone every hour, I get a location, and they use that to do analysis. And what they showed with very high levels of statistical rigor is that any 4 data points uniquely identifies an individual 95% of the time. Only 3 data points, and they do not have to be in sequence. 4 random, taken from 24 hours in a day, tells you who a person is. 80% of the time, I only need 3 data points. And 2 data points, 50% of the times, I can uniquely identify an individual. So I have Wi-Fi sniffers. I observe cars coming down the road. I see cars at multiple intersections. I'm doing travel times and origin destination on the arterial. Guess what? I can identify who you are, even though I don't have anything else with it, because I can go and get other data to connect to it. Also, in Montoya's findings, they determined that spatial aggregation actually has a relatively low impact on my ability to take trace data and identify an individual. The relationship is 1/10, so 10 times aggregation equals a very small increase in privacy. So taking trace data, cell phone, lat long kinds of a data, and going to TAZ, going to zip code, I can still identify an extremely high percentage of trips. What that means is that I can take trace data from a cell phone, and I can have to keep it during a time period in order to estimate a trace. I can remove the ID and say this is a trace. Well, guess what? I can probably identify who that is. I can hash those IDs so other people can use it. You'll never know what my bank account is. Well, with a little bit of work from a data broker, I can re-identify who you are anyway. So all of these data sets that we are now collecting, Wi-Fi, transit fare card, LBS stands for location-based services. That is, when you get on Facebook and Facebook collects all kinds of information. By the way, the Facebook app on your phone is really data hungry. It steals all kinds of information about you, which they then sell. The trace from your Facebook app is very identifiable, even if they removed the ID. Of course, they often sell the ID anyway. Okay? So that's the outcome of Montoya. The danger of this is bad things can happen with it. And how identifiable it is, again, this is not a trace example, but it's a really good one, and you can look up the report in it. A study that Montoya cites says, I took a medical database, I went and extracted some voter records, and I can extract from the health records who had the governor of Massachusetts. Think how scary that is. So while most uses of trace data are benign, once we start to hand out trace data, you set up the use for bad purposes of data that you think is benign. I removed all the identities. It's not a problem. Well, actually, if someone really wants to, it is. As we learn more about what data is and what can be done with it, as we learn to match it for all kinds of good business purposes, we suddenly realize the dangers it provides to the individual. The Europeans have headed along this line much faster than the Americans, and so they have gone to adopt a new general data protection standard called GDPR. And you have already been impacted by this because you probably got 20 emails in the month of May talking about updates to your privacy policies of all your email newsletters and everything else along that line. Because anybody that's collected cookies in the European Union now has to follow GDPR standards. And what GDPR says is that individuals can remove themselves from these data sets. Now, if you want to work in Europe, if you want to start to think about GDPR and you're collecting trace data, even if you're an American transit agency, these are things you're going to have to consider. But individual privacy isn't the only issue. Business privacy is a problem. Businesses use data to run their services. Businesses, unlike American transit agencies, American state DOTs, they need revenue to actually stay in business. Data drives their services, where they go, how they use it, what they provide, and what they don't provide. When businesses are forced to or encouraged to share data, there is a tremendous risk to those businesses from loss of proprietary information. Things like the size of their market, where they're positioning their attributes, how they price those services, so that a competitor can come in and take their market away from them by underpricing, by changing, by providing a better service to know that I will succeed here because somebody else already has. So businesses are very concerned about sharing data because the sharing of that data, particularly if it is shared widely, reshared, retweeted essentially, could in fact put them out of business. They're also concerned of fear of missing out of public agencies. I need all your data. I'm going to take it. Oh, look, I've just analyzed it, and I'm going to come after you for this regulatory thing that you did wrong. Businesses don't want to be set up for somebody else to pick through their data to find out something that they can then be held accountable for. So businesses have their own view of data sharing. It's not that they're anti-data sharing, it's the risk-reward relationship is very different. So while everybody wants everybody else's data, well, at least most of the time, they have to understand that there are consequences of sharing that they really need to consider before they do so. In the public sector, you have to be aware of what it means to take data from the private sector. You have to be aware of what it means when you have it. Who do you have to share it with? How do you have to share it? Do you have the ability to manage it and protect it? We understand as the public sector that we're very interested in this world with new private services. We want to manage them. We have to understand if I'm going to subsidize first mile, last mile services, I want to know what I'm getting. I want to know if it's working. I need to know about social equity issues. I want your data, private company I'm working with, to help me work through this. Of course I should have this data. Those are important things for me. It's a good for the public. But the question then comes from the business side. Well, wait a minute. If I have to tell you everything about my business because I went to this effort of working with you as a partnership, and now you just give away all of my business secrets and put me out of business, this is not a good partnership. So why do I want to share data with you? Are you going to require it from me in order to actually operate in this area? Well, that's one thing. Am I going to gain revenue from this? Am I going to gain goodwill? What's the benefit? I've talked about very briefly the business risk. So what's the benefit to a business of participating when the risks are actually quite high? As you start to address, this is a place where risk is low, benefit is high, I want to do this, regardless of coming from the private or public sector. The next thing you really want to work with when you work across agencies is what is the data? What do they really say? We have a group out here in the Seattle metro area that wants all dockless bike people to indicate that yes or no, I'm wearing a helmet. And I think on their app, as they unlock a dockless bike, I think what person is ever going to admit that they're not wearing a helmet when it's against the law? So are they going to get valid data out of that? Or are people just going to say, oh, of course I am, and then unlock the bike and ride off? There's no actual feedback on that. Are the data biased? We're very interested in where people are riding bikes. Are they using our infrastructure? So great, we have dockless bike share. Well, the people who ride dockless bike share are really different than the mammals of the world. And if you don't know, mammal is an acronym. You have to learn it. It's the best thing you'll take away from us. Mammals are middle-aged men in Lycra. People who ride really good bikes really fast. And trust me, they use very different paths than people who rent big, heavy, dockless bikes. So if you think Strava has a really cool data set, they do. If you think dockless bikes could have a really good data set, we do. But to add them together, their paths are going to be different. If you only measure one or the other, your answers aren't necessarily the reality of where people are going. So do you know the bikes? Do you know the data? Do you know what you're getting and how you're getting it and what's in it or what isn't in it? The idea of, if I am requiring that you send me data, are you verifying, and I'm going to hold your regulatory feet to the fire with that. Do you believe that they've actually given you all of the data, the correct data? Does the data I'm sending in actually answers the question I want? Can it? So one big question, that's my 15 minutes. You heard my alarm go off. I'll try to quickly finish this up. It's a little longer than 15. Sorry about that. A big question in this is, can the data actually answer your question? There are questions like the helmet one that I asked for, or the bias in the sample size. Do you understand what's present or what's not present? In dockless bikes, are all of the bikes showing up in your data feed? Or are there some of them that aren't? What is in the system? What is not in the system? How big is your sample? Are they willing to talk to you about that? Many of our private data sources decline to tell you the sample. Do you trust it or do you not? These are questions that you have to become aware of when you are either buying a data set or requiring that data be given to you. In large part because sometimes the data they have doesn't answer your question. In dockless bikes, we really want to know how many people are parking bikes at blocked sidewalks. But the data collection mechanism is a GPS device. It doesn't have that level of accuracy. Next, how are you going to use the data? This big question in the public sector side is, we need data. We don't know what we're asking for. You just have to give us all the data and then we'll look at it and we'll figure it out. Fear of missing out. On the other hand, the business side of, oh no, you're just going to take all of my data and you're going to keep looking at it until you find something wrong, that's a non-starter. So one of the things you really want to start to think about is, what rules are we allowed to operate under? How are you going to use my data? What do you want to use it? So the public sector has to come at it just like the business sector has and say, what am I sharing? Why am I sharing it? What are they going to do with this? And is this okay? When it comes to things like trace data or fare card data, this becomes a real question. Should I be sharing this in the first place? Or is that the public sector's misuse of public trust? By the way, if you go on and looked, what is it that I have to share? What can't I deny? What can I deny handing out under Public Records Acts? We have to be careful as we start to move into these public sharing, is what is it that I'm actually giving away? Because public sharing has a risk. And if you as a public agency go out and give away a whole bunch of data that could very well create problems for people, that could set up bad outcomes for your agencies. On the other hand, Public Records Acts specifically state that public data is available to the public. But those acts differ from one state to another, often from one city to another. The state of Washington has an incredibly open Public Records Act. If a public agency uses a record to make a decision, even if I'm aggregating up, anything I see, anything I touch is subject to public records release unless it's specifically in state law exempted. So one of the things that's not exempted is Uber or Lyft records. So if the city of Seattle captures Uber and Lyft records, Lyft can Freedom of Information Act the release of Uber's data, which of course makes them want nothing to do with sharing data with the city of Seattle. Alternatively, in the state of California, the state constitution specifically allows for redaction of anything that causes a privacy concern. So the question is, what actually does that mean? How do you go forward in a public records release? How do we share these things? Taking that information, understanding what's allowed, what isn't allowed, and working within the legal structure is where things like trusted data repositories come around, where a group is trusted to be a neutral third party to perform all of the data sharing tasks to give out the data that's allowed to be given out. The key is that that trusted data repository has to be neutral. They have to have very strong policies and protocols for how data can be used and by whom. And you have to have a great deal of protection, both from hacking and from accidental release of different kinds of information. Two data repositories that are actively being brought to market are the ones that the University of Washington is working on. Again, in our state, this is an absolute necessity to have a trusted third party that can work within the confines of our very open public records law. That's what the Transportation Data Collaborative is. NACTO has also been working very hard on open transport partnerships under their Share Streets program to help work through this. Now, sharing is good, but as you go forward, you really have to come through both from what it is you need to achieve and what it is the partners in your data sharing need to achieve and what their risks are. Be aware as you step forward that you really have to define the data to be shared and an understanding of what is and isn't in it, to define the uses and users of what that data should be, the policies of what works, how you're going to guard privacy of both individuals and companies, how you're going to maintain data security, and then what procedures you're going to have in order to provide an audit and accountability of the use of that data. It's actually a fascinating, dynamic area. It's also really in flux right now as we try to figure out how to make this work forward. So forgive me, I know I'm a few minutes over my 15. That's about as fast as I can do it. It's a fascinating topic. I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to working with many of you as we go forward on data sharing. Thank you. Alice, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Lots of good information there. So we've got a bunch of questions coming in, and as a reminder, all the listeners can enter questions into the question box on the side of your screen. We're going to start going through the ones that have come in already. Mark, what safeguards need to be built into the development of mobility as a service in the United States as that becomes more and more popular to balance all of the challenges and opportunities that you've been discussing?
Well, mobility as a service is a brutal thing. And the reason it's brutal is because most of the business opportunities are driven, the business risk is in giving away your interaction with the customer. And so mobility as a service is going to have real significant issues on identifying who an individual is and who is allowed to share it. So the data policy about that is going to be really difficult to work out with the different providers. And then you're going to have essentially GDPR level records on who's allowed to see that, how they're allowed to see it, and how they're allowed to work on it. And then you're going to have to figure out how to transfer information back and forth between the different providers and who gets to control access to that particular participant, that subject.
Mm-hmm. All right. Going back to public records requests, can you expand a little bit more about the rights that agencies have? And you said it was state by state and sometimes city by city. Are there any instances that you're aware of that public agencies might be able to monetize the value of this data like private agencies can? Or is the fact that it's under public records request mean that they really are never going to be able to leverage it in the same way?
So first, that will depend very much from agency or from state to state, from legal area to legal area. The other thing is you're going to have to be very careful about, if you go back in traveler information, we had the highway folks in the late 90s had a belief that we were going to monetize all our traffic data. And the reality is we got very little out of it. And the reason is almost all monetization requires scale. So they need geographic distribution. You need data everywhere. And that tends to be not the way public agencies collect data. And that really reduces the market for your data. So it's possible, even under an Open Records Act, where I provide an API, you can get it and everybody pays the same amount of money. What you can't do is sell it then to one agency and not the other, or sell it to one under one term and not the other under another term. So it's not that Public Records Act prevents you from monetizing, but monetizing public data is difficult, and you're going to have to be very careful about how you do that. I highly recommend an old ITS America report called Choosing the Route to Traveler Information Systems. It will give you a lot of insight based on traveler information systems about the potential for monetizing data.
Got it. And then going back to those differences between the state-by-state laws, is there any way that more universal standards could be developed? And if they can be, should they be?
Well, I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm going to say it will be very difficult to do that. It's possible that the federal government could write some overriding rules. I mean, that might be necessary under connected and autonomous vehicle types of legislation, with specific protections at the national level that override state laws. But now how well you can do that, you're way beyond my knowledge.
Got it. So another hot topic in transportation, especially over on the West Coast where you are, is the mileage-based user fee programs. What are some of the data privacy and security issues that might arise with the mileage-based fees, and how can we mitigate issues around that?
So it will depend a lot on what the individual laws say. In Washington, one of the exemptions is your toll record. So I think if the state legislature decides to go to a mileage-based fee, they would when they made that big of a change to the state constitution, they would add something in the law that specifically defines a mileage-based record as a toll record, which means you can only get it with a subpoena. So I think the mileage-based fees will fit under some of the more restrictive exemptions in almost every state for who can see what. But surprisingly, the TNC stuff does not. So Lyft and Uber and dockless bike, a lot of those don't, and they don't have the constituency that mileage-based fees will have.
And somebody just asked, and I'm not sure if this was before or after you mentioned the tolling systems that they've been dealing with a lot of this for years. Is there anything we can learn from that, or does that really have to do with how it's written into the law?
It all has to do with how it's written into the law, and for the most part, most tolling systems operate under the same basic legal structure because of how all the state laws have acknowledged that. And so essentially, you can't see somebody else's toll record unless you go to a judge and there's a reason, a divorce case where you're suing each other, and then one of you can go look up the other one's toll records. So usually it requires that kind of effort in order to go to it. But once you go there, you can see that, but you can't see anybody else's stuff. But the same thing, California water records, those are the same kinds of issues. There have been data sharing in California water records, but again, aggregation becomes a problem. So yeah, they're all issues of that nature.
For the trusted data repositories, do they need a special legislative authority from the state to carve out the Public Records Act request?
So it will depend on the state. One of the reasons the university is going forward with the data collaborative is there is, in our very open law, there is a specific exemption for university research. So long as we're doing research on the data, and there's lots of research to be done on all of these wonderful data, we can protect the data from release. However, everything we give to a public agency, whatever it is we give to the public agency, any summary statistics, any report, all of that is subject to open record. What's not is the data we're actually doing research on. But then that's Washington's law. So I think you will find many other states have similar laws. The real question is how open are their open records acts?
And given
on the other hand, let me add one other thing. We did just have a state Supreme Court ruling. Uber and Lyft gave the city of Seattle zip code level origin destination summaries at the requirement of the city and claimed it as trade secret. And the state Supreme Court, after 2.5 years, decided that the Open Records Act trumped the State Trade Secrets Act and caused it to be released. So some of this stuff is just flat case law waiting for somebody really high up in the court system to make a decision. Go ahead.
Yeah, and for people interested in those, they can look through the last month of Transportation Weekly, and we do have an article about the Seattle case, and then an article about some of the performance measure requirements for Uber and Lyft in New York City and the data associated with that too. We're going to do one more question and run just a little bit over because there's a lot of questions, a lot of interest in these topics. Even with the different state-by-state differences, do you think it would be possible to develop kind of a boilerplate P3 data sharing agreement that could be adjusted for various needs at different agencies in different states?
So what we are working on at the Data Collaborative is a 3-part agreement with our partners. The first is a basic agreement to share. And then we have a data sharing agreement, which defines the specific data that we will be absorbing from each data provider. And the third is a data use agreement. The data use agreement is a 3-party agreement that says this provider will share through the repository with this user, and it defines the uses that each user is allowed to do. Who gets to see what data? And what that means is, let's say that we eventually get Uber or Lyft data. We're working hard on that. Uber might allow a university researcher to see a particular set of data for a very specific purpose, but not allow the city to see that data. They might allow the city to see one set of data. They might allow the state to see a different set of data or a different level of aggregation, where the owners of the data are then very definitely the providers of the data, and they get to control what those uses are. And I don't think you will see, in the end, after 2 years of working this up, that really works because it provides a level of security in the use of their data for all the partners. The downside is you have to negotiate this every time there's a new use, and we have to set up a cycle to deal with that. But given the risks of both privacy and of the individual agencies, that negotiation is actually a really good review process. So could you do that truly nationally? I'm going to bet no, because the uses are so different from user to user, from use case to use case. There might, maybe I'm going to pick a number, 10 basic models maybe would work. A city model, a county model, a TNC model versus, a Wi-Fi travel time model. Some different kinds of data, different kinds of uses. But a single one-size-fits-all, I just don't think it'll work.
All right, great. Well, unfortunately, we are over time. There are still some questions we didn't quite get to, and we will follow up on email with some of those people to answer the questions. Thank everybody for tuning in and for listening and for your participation. Thank you very much, Mark, for joining us and for sharing so much knowledge. Eno is going to stay engaged in all of these issues as technologies and practices continue to evolve and data sharing cases pop up around the country and with different companies and jurisdictions. And we want to remind everybody to keep an eye out for our webinar next month, which will also be with the University of Washington covering issues around urban freight movement. And just as a reminder also, you can find the slides, which will be put up on our website at enotrans.org, where you can also subscribe to Eno Transportation Weekly, an invaluable resource on all aspects of transportation policy and practice. Thanks again for your participation, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much. Have a great one, everybody.